and we're going to look at some texts now. I just want to mention all of these texts are from my book, The Essential Kabbalah, and I sent Ari a link. People can find a PDF of the entire book. You're welcome to purchase the paperback. It's an inexpensive paperback, but there's a PDF available, and Ari will email it out or put it in the chat, and you can look at selections or print out the whole thing. We're going to continue now with a few selections focusing on Ein Sof for the moment. So let me share screen, and we're looking here at some passages. We're going to start with this one on the right, non-duality. This is my title. It's not a Kabbalistic term. I'm just calling it non-duality. These teachings, the two on the right side of the page, are from Moses Cordovero, a very prolific Kabbalist who lived in Sfat, in that beautiful Galilean mountaintop village. I'm sure many of you have been there. And this is what Moses Cordovero has to say about God. He was also the author of the passage, The Nature of God, that we looked at last week. And now we're continuing with two of his teachings. We're going to look at both of these teachings, and then I'll pause if there are questions. But let's dive in. The essence of divinity is found in every single thing. Nothing but it exists. Since it causes everything to be, no thing can live by anything else. It enlivens them. Its existence exists in each existent. Okay, that word existence simply means any existing thing. You notice the pronoun here, it, okay? This is not God as he. It's not even God as she, the Shekhinah. We'll talk more about Shekhinah next week in our final session. But this is Ein Sof, who is beyond all gender. So that's why I use the neutral pronoun it. Do not attribute duality to God. Let God be solely God. Okay, we'll see in a moment what he means by duality. If you suppose that Ein Sof, okay, now we finally come to that term, Ein Sof. We talked about it last week. Literally, there is no end, or the infinite. You could translate it as infinity or the infinite. This is a great invention of the Kabbalah to call God infinity. If you suppose that Ein Sof emanates until a certain point, okay, to emanate is simply to flow, to emerge, and that from that point on is outside of it, you have dualized, God forbid. Realize rather that Ein Sof exists in each existent. Do not say this is a stone and not God. God forbid. Rather, all existence is God, and the stone is a thing pervaded by divinity. Okay, this is a very striking teaching, very radical teaching. You might say it's very close to pantheism, right? Pantheism, from the root pan, theos, all is God. Spinoza is often described as a pantheist. Many mystical systems teach that. In general, Judaism seems to be opposed to pantheism because God is transcendent, God is beyond the world. But Cordovero is saying that, you remember his critique last week in the nature of God. Don't think of God as Father in heaven. Rather think of God as Ein Sof. And now we see a little more clearly what that means. You could say that for Cordovero, God is that which animates all of being. Right? In other words, don't say that there's emanation. Don't say that God pours out until a certain point, and then you have the world separate from God. That would be a dualism. Now, this is interesting because usually we think of dualism as saying that there are two gods, right? Two divine forces. This is often seen as the Jewish critique of Christianity, right? To have a trinity. How could God be divided into three? It sounds like that's infringing, violating pure monotheism. So usually duality, theological duality or dualism refers to multiple divinities. But for Cordovero, that's really not what duality means. What does duality mean? If you say there's God and not God, that already is dualism. In other words, you shouldn't say there's the world and God, Rather, God becomes the world. God animates the world. God pervades the world. Notice what he says. Do not say this is a stone and not God. Now, it sounds very strange for a rabbi, right? Cordovero is not only a mystic, a Kabbalist, he's a rabbi, he's a great scholar of Talmud, also very well versed in Maimonides, a great all around Jewish teacher. And yet he says, don't say this is a stone and not God. That makes you think immediately of the Ten Commandments, right? Don't bow down to any image. Don't worship any graven image. Now, Cordovero is certainly not going to bow down to a stone, but he doesn't want to exclude God from the stone. His understanding of God is really the energy that animates the universe. Let's do the second passage also, and then we can pause for a couple of questions. Okay, this again is Moses Cordovero writing in the 16th century. The first great creative period of Kabbalah is the 13th century in Spain with the Zohar. And the next great period of Kabbalah is a few centuries later in Sfat, in Safed in the 16th century. That's where Cordovero is living with Isaac Luria and a circle of Kabbalists. So here's what Cordovero says. Before anything emanated, okay, before anything emerged from God to become the world, there was only Ein Sof. Okay, there was only God as infinity. You could picture an ocean, an infinite ocean. Ein Sof was all that existed. Similarly, after it brought into being that which exists, there is nothing but it. Okay, we can pause right there. It's an amazing couple of sentences. Three sentences. Before anything existed, there was only Ein Sof. Okay, before creation. Now, what's the situation after creation? What's the situation when the world has come into being? There's still only Ein Sof. But of course, now Ein Sof has manifested as the world. So the world isn't totally separate from God. The world is an expression of that divine energy. You could almost think of this as a physicist would speak of energy and matter. Okay, I don't want to equate them exactly, but it's a useful analogy. A physicist would say that ultimately energy is not totally distinct from matter, right? That was one of the great contributions of Einstein. E equals mc squared. Energy is a form of matter. Matter is a form of energy. Sometimes physicists say it this way: matter is frozen energy. Okay, matter is energy that is slowed down enough that it temporarily takes the form of matter. But ultimately, the two are really two expressions of the same underlying paradoxical reality. And something similar is going on here. Before the world was created, there was only God. After the world has been created, there's still only God. But God has turned into the world. God has manifested in the world. You cannot find anything that exists apart from it. Hey, again, it is Ein Sof. Nothing exists apart from God. There is nothing that is not pervaded by the power of divinity. If there were, Ein Sof would be limited, subject to duality, God forbid. Rather, God is everything that exists, though everything that exists is not God. Obviously, that sounds paradoxical. You could say it's a Jewish koan, a Jewish paradoxical teaching. We'll come back to it in a moment. It is present in everything, and everything comes into being from it. Nothing is devoid of its divinity. Everything is within it. It is within everything and outside of everything. There is nothing but it. Okay, toward the end there, you almost feel like he's saying something and then immediately denying it. This really shows you the limitation of language. He's talking about something that's almost beyond expression, so it's very difficult to put it into words. So let's come back to that paradoxical line in the middle. God is everything that exists, though everything that exists is not God. How can that make any sense? I think what that may mean is God is the energy that turns into all material existence, but don't be fooled into thinking that any one thing represents the totality. Okay, that would be idolatry. To think that any one person or any one object is God is the totality of God, that's a mistake. One should be open to the notion that God animates everything. Okay, let's pause here, and I'm sure a few questions have come up. And
Right. So feel free to chat questions, as I mentioned when we opened the program. So here's two that I can start with. The
great.
first is just going back to the word Ein Sof. Where does that first appear as a word? I mean, that we know of.
Yeah. I think the first author to use it is an early Kabbalist named Isaac the Blind, Yitzchak Sagi Nahor. He was actually blind. He lived in the beginning of the 13th century, and he has a commentary on Sefer Yetzirah, a commentary on the Book of Creation. He's considered one of the founders of Kabbalah, and as far as I know, he's the first to use that term. Now, I should say, I mentioned last week, Maimonides would be very comfortable with that notion of God, that God is infinite. And so one of the great revolutions of Kabbalah, you could say, is partly dependent on that great rationalist, that great philosophical thinker.
Terrific. A second question, which is, you said it in the first lecture, in your session, you're saying it now. You talk about the different periods of the evolution so far of Spanish Kabbalah coming into the 4th and 13th century Spain, and then we go to the Moses Cordovero, 16th century Sfat. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of Kabbalah between the 13th century and the 16th century, and why Moses Cordovero is saying what he's saying here? What is he adding to the
Hmm.
discussion that
Yeah,
wasn't
so the,
in the
the
original?
Zohar is written in Spain, right? And Spain was a very creative, great creative center of Jewish life. Part of its richness has to do with the fact that Jews and Christians and Muslims all lived near each other and influenced each other. It wasn't a time of total harmony, but there was interpenetration and mutual influence. You remember, of course, in 1492, the Jews are expelled from Spain. One of the few positive elements of that expulsion was that the wisdom of Jewish teaching then spread to the wider Jewish world. So, really, because of the expulsion from Spain, Kabbalah spread through much of the Mediterranean and into Northern Europe. So, why is the 16th century then the great creative period? Because many Jews who were exiled from Spain, they figured if we're kicked out of Spain, maybe we'll keep going across the coast of North Africa or across the Mediterranean, and a good number of them ended up going to the Holy Land. So there was a circle of Kabbalists who made their way to Tzfat in the Galilee, and there they formed a mystical community, praying together, meditating together, inspiring one another. And that's where Cordovero and Isaac Luria, that's where Lachadodi was written, right? That beautiful hymn, maybe one of the most beloved parts of the whole Siddur, that hymn welcoming the Sabbath Queen, the Sabbath Bride. Actually, its mystical meaning is about the union of the divine male and the divine female, because the Sabbath Bride is identified with Shekhinah. So basically, what happened in Sfat is the ideas of the Zohar were lived out in community. This is a community of Kabbalists who took the ideas of the Zohar and practiced them. So that's why Kabbalat Shabbat, the welcoming of Shabbat, that really was born in Sfat by Kabbalists who were taking the ideas of the Zohar and living them out. And one of the next great creative periods is, of course, Hasidism. So you could say the Zohar in the 13th century in Spain, then you have a community living it out in Sfat, and then you have it spread to the masses through Hasidism.
I guess the question was really, you included this paragraph in this teaching from Moses Cordovero. How does it advance
Hmm.
Kabbalah from what someone would have taught in the 13th century?
Yeah, I don't think the Zohar doesn't come out and say that God is everything, right? To come out and say explicitly God is everything, he could be charged with pantheism. Then the question is, well, what about evil? If God is in everything, then is everything okay? Is everything holy? Why keep kosher? Isn't God as much in a pig as in a cow? So it opens up a lot of questions. But Cordovero in a sense, was totally committed to Jewish law and Jewish practice, and yet he was convinced there's a mystical reality. There's a divine energy he could feel bubbling up out of everything. So he's a theologian and a rabbi. You could say part of what he does is to combine Maimonides with Kabbalah. Now that sounds like a great challenge because Maimonides, as I said, would have agreed with the idea that God is Ein Sof, but Maimonides, as I mentioned, would be turning over in his grave to hear anything about sexuality within God, a masculine and feminine within God. And yet Cordovero learned from both of them. He's trying to turn Kabbalah into a systematic theology. I guess you could say that that's really what he's doing.
Thank you. And since you opened the door, Susan asks the question, which is, what about the adversary, Hasatan? So that, according to this, that is all God as well. There's no separate, there can't be a separate character in the story. And then how does that work within the system?
Right. So Satan or the demonic, in a sense, you could say the philosophers, this is one interesting difference between the philosophers and Kabbalah. Jewish philosophy basically avoided the problem of evil. They saw evil just as the lack of divinity, the lack of good. And Kabbalah engages that problem. What Kabbalah really says is that the demonic is the shadow side of the divine. Right? If God is everything, then there has to be some divine origin to evil as well. So the name that the Zohar uses for the demonic is literally Sitra Achra, which means the other side. The other side of what? The other side of God. So there's a dark, chaotic under level, a deep level within God. It's not really opposed to God. It's the other half of God. It sounds very bizarre, but I think it's better to address this on a human level than a divine level. The challenge on the human level is what do you do with your evil urge? Right? That phrase is very prominent already in rabbinic literature, Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. You have an interesting teaching in the Mishnah, which is that you should serve God with your good inclination and with your evil inclination. That's a statement in the Mishnah. Now, how could you possibly serve God with your evil inclination? Well, you might say, well, the way you serve God with your evil inclination is to reject the evil inclination. That would be a more pietistic traditional view. But the Jewish mystics look at it much more dialectically. They say, no, you have to mine the evil urge. You have to draw out its chaotic power and channel it toward the good. In other words, it's safer to reject evil, but what Kabbalah says is that you should draw on that chaotic energy and sublimate it or uplift it. Right? Carl Jung really speaks about this in terms of the shadow. You have to engage the shadow. A person isn't complete unless he's come to terms with that, with the fear, with the anger, with the lust, with the greed, not to simply reject it, but to rechannel it. So that challenge of rechanneling chaotic energy, that's how you could say Kabbalistic psychology deals with evil, but it bases it on the theological idea that evil is part of the whole, WHOLE, that evil is part of the picture. It can't simply be rejected, it has to be redeemed. Eventually, in Hasidism, this turns into raising the strange thoughts. If you have evil urges, you shouldn't just reject them. You should sublimate them. You should rechannel them. So that's a continuum from the statement in the Mishnah, serve God with your evil impulse, to Kabbalah's understanding, and finally a psychology that develops somewhat in Kabbalah and then more in Hasidism. Okay, it's obviously easier said than done, but the important point is that the mystics are trying to include everything in their service of God, even if it's a dangerous path.
Mm. One more question, then I think we should go back to the text, which is from,
Right.
with respect to the mystics, how did they approach prayer? What was the purpose of prayer? And how
Mm.
did it differ from maybe another traditional Jewish approach to prayer?
Yeah, that's a great question. We can come back to Ein Sof. How do you pray to Ein Sof? Right? If Ein Sof is infinity, then you're part of infinity. So how can you stand back and pray to God? This is a problem in Jewish mystical literature because remember, Cordovero, even though he's saying everything is God, he's then going to go into the synagogue and pray mincha or pray the afternoon prayer or the evening prayer, the morning prayer. And what do you find there? Blessed are you, O Lord our God. So how can he be reaching out to Ein Sof, to the infinite, if he's part of the infinite? And yet he was able to do that. Kabbalah talks about Ein Sof, but remember, you can't really say much about infinity. Kabbalah spends most of its time speaking not about Ein Sof, but about the personal God. I would say Ein Sof is beyond the personal God. Traditional prayer is more relevant for the notion of a personal God, someone I can address, someone I can cry out to. For Ein Sof, it's not the traditional prayers that really work. You might say meditation. Meditation is the most appropriate form of prayer to have some sense of infinity because you're part of this greater oneness. So in meditation, we get beyond words. Now you might say, how can Jews get beyond words, right? Jews seem so obsessed with words, right? On Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we actually read an entire book, right? On Yom Kippur, we go through hundreds of pages in one day. Where is there room for silence? You might say Kabbalah wants to make room for silence. We mentioned last week that Psalms is a beautiful origin of Jewish mysticism, right? People sometimes speak about the rabbinic forms of mysticism or Kabbalah or later forms of. You go back to Psalms, it's a beautiful line. I believe it's in Psalm 65. Lecha dumiyah tehillah. To you, silence is praise. That's what we find in Psalm 65. To you, silence is praise. Now, what does that mean? It could mean that it's impossible to adequately speak out to God, so silence is the greatest expression. But I think it's really an incentive for meditation. Silence is the most appropriate way to get in touch with God as oneness, God as infinity. So part of what Kabbalah does is to fill the traditional liturgy with new meaning, but part of what it does is to make room for something beyond words, for the silence.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go back to a few more texts here. I want to move on now to actually one more passage of Cordovero. Here. This is concealing and revealing. When powerful light is concealed and clothed in a garment, it is revealed. Though concealed, the light is actually revealed. For were it not concealed, it could not be revealed. Okay, this is what gives mysticism a bad name, right? The lines like this. It sounds like he's just talking nonsense, but let's be patient. This is like wishing to gaze at the dazzling sun. Its dazzle conceals it, for you cannot look at its overwhelming brilliance, right? Like when there's a solar eclipse, you can't stare right at the sun, that it would blind you. So what can you do? Yet when you conceal it, looking at it through screens, you can see and not be harmed. So it is with emanation. By concealing and clothing itself, it reveals itself. Okay, so what is he saying? He's comparing God to the sun. You can't stare into the sun, you'll ruin your eyes. But if you look at it through a filter, then you can appreciate the light. So, similarly with God, you can't encounter the divine directly, you would be blown away. So, you have to approach God through some garment, through some filter. Now, the question is, what is the filter? What is it that allows us to engage with God and shield ourselves? Okay, Cordovero doesn't come out and say it here, but I think what he's really implying is that this is nature. This is the world. This is creation. Creation is the way that God communicates himself, herself, itself to us. In other words, we can encounter God through the world. We can encounter God through meeting another person. We can encounter God through a sunset, through a rainbow, through a mountain, through a hike, through a swim. By finding the divine energy in the world, we encounter God, but now in a bearable way, in a manageable way. And the companion piece to this is the very next one. And here we're finally getting beyond Cordovero. This next one is a very short teaching, just 4 lines. This is from a Kabbalist named Shimon Lavi. As I mentioned last week, all the authors' names and some notes and explanation are at the very back of the book, The Essential Kabbalah. I didn't want to intrude on the text itself with any footnote numbers or even the name of the author. This is a man, Shimon Lavi, also 16th century, a contemporary of Cordovero, of Isaac Luria. He was a Kabbalist who lived in North Africa. He actually lived on the island of Jerba, off the coast of Libya. There's a very prominent Jewish community there, and
Tunisia.
apparently Shimon
I think it's Tunisia.
of
Gerba.
Tunisia. Yeah, thank you. And Shimon Lavi was on his way to Palestine, to the Holy Land, actually. His family had been exiled from Spain, but he stopped on the island of Jerba, and the community there convinced him to stay. So he spent the rest of his life as the rabbi in Jerba, but he spent his free time writing a commentary on the Zohar. And this is from his commentary on the Zohar. And this is what he says. With the appearance of the light, the universe expanded. Okay, it sounds almost like the Big Bang. This is someone writing in the 16th century. With the appearance of the light, the universe expanded. With the concealment of the light, the things that exist were created in all their variety. This is the secret of the act of creation. One who understands will understand. Here we have 4 lines there. If we can get these 4 lines, according to Shimon Lavi, we have the secret of creation, but we don't even have to worry about 4 lines, right? The last one just says, one who understands will understand. The Hebrew there is v'hamevin yavin. It kind of means if you get it, you got it. The 3rd line just says, this is the secret. Okay, so we're down to 2 lines. Let's just try to understand these 2 lines. Now, the first line, as I said, is almost a paraphrase of the Big Bang. With the appearance of the light, the universe expanded. So the second line is more intriguing. With the concealment of the light, the things that exist were created in all their variety. That sounds strange. You would imagine he should say, with the appearance of the light, the things that exist were created. Why does he say, with the concealment of the light, the things that exist were created? So apparently for Shimon Lavi, at first there's this explosion of light, this expansion of the universe, but that itself would not allow for anything to exist independently. This again is a little bit like what modern cosmology says, right? The Big Bang is the beginning of everything, but if you only had that energy expanding out, nothing would ever form. The energy would just keep moving and moving. It's only because things cool down enough that gravity can help them to congeal. That's how you have the first stars and galaxies and planets and creatures. You might just change one letter, in fact. A cosmologist would say not with the concealment of the light, but with the congealment of the light. If the light or energy slows down, it can turn into matter. But why the concealment? Why not just appearance? Why concealment? Really, similarly with physics, uh, just the appearance of the light would not allow for anything to have a boundary or a border. You need some definition to things. You need some structure, some limitation, some concealment. That's what allows for you and me and trees and water and flowers to exist as separate entities. So it's really a rhythm here, a rhythm of appearance and hiding, of boundlessness and borders. That is the secret. The secret isn't one or the other. The secret is the interplay of that expansion and that contraction, of that powerful explosion of energy and the beauty of individuality, right? Mystics often emphasize oneness, the oneness of everything. But here the point is that there's oneness and there's multiplicity, and both of them should be appreciated. Let's pause there too. And if there are questions specifically on that, first, if not, then we can take something a little more general. But if anyone is puzzled or intrigued by what we just read, please. I think you're still muted, Ari.
Sorry. I said there's a good question that I think relates to this text and the other text that you share in your book. There's two questions that I think are good. Number one, what language was this text written in and the other texts? And the reason I ask is because when we study, let's say it's written in Hebrew or even Aramaic, people are wondering what words they're using for the words you put in English, and are there words playing with other words from the Torah? We don't see it because we don't even know what the words look like. You didn't give us the Hebrew. You didn't give us the original. So that's the first question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to read the Hebrew of the short one that we just looked at because some of you know Hebrew, and to give you a sense, but just to answer you more generally, the Zohar was written in Aramaic, and that's fascinating too. Why was it written in Aramaic? All the other texts we're looking at, and almost every other book of Kabbalah, traditional Kabbalah, is written in Hebrew. Why was the Zohar written in Aramaic? You might say to make it look ancient. The Zohar was written in the 13th century in Spain, but the author never admitted that he was the author. He attributed it to the ancient Rabbi Shimon. And to make it look ancient, he composed the Zohar in the language of the Talmud, as if he's saying, this is the Talmud that disappeared. This is a volume of rabbinic literature that disappeared. So that's why it's written in Aramaic. It's a very creative, poetic Aramaic with a lot of plays on biblical words. But let's just look again at this passage I just read. I want to read you the Hebrew here. And those of you who know Hebrew, you can match it up. Okay. Ki bahofia haor nitrachev ha'olam. Okay, and that's literally, with the appearance of the light, the universe expanded. Uvigenizato, okay, that word geniza, right? A geniza is where books are hidden away. The root ganaz is to hide. Uvigenizato nivru kol hanimtsaim leminehem. Zehu sod, this is the secret. Zehu sod ma'aseh bereshit. Okay, what's the Hebrew word for creation? Bereshit. Bereshit, of course, is the first word of the Torah, in the beginning. This is the secret of the act of in the beginning. Okay, but Bereshit is what a Jewish mystic would use, or a Jewish writer would use to refer to creation. Zehu sod ma'aseh Bereshit. This is the secret of creation. V'hamevin, one who understands, yavin. V'hamevin, yavin. So one other thing I want to mention, my book, The Essential Kabbalah, Ari's going to send out a link where you can find the PDF. For those of you who know some Hebrew, that same link includes the Hebrew original of the Essential Kabbalah. These were all texts I translated from the Hebrew, and after I created the English book, a friend of mine in Jerusalem, Yakub, he published a Hebrew version of it. The Hebrew is Lev HaKabbalah. There are only a few copies left of that, I think, in his bookstore. But the PDF of the Hebrew is also available via the link that Ari will send out or show you. So if you know some Hebrew, you can match up the Hebrew and the English.
Someone asked the word emanations as you translated in the prior reading. What was that in the Hebrew?
The emanation is often shefa. Shefa means an abundant flow, or the other word is atzilut. Atzilut is the technical term. Aleph, Tzadi, Yud, Lamed, Vav, Taf. You could spell it Atsilut. Atzilut is a technical name for emanation. And sometimes the Kabbalists use the more poetic term shefa, the flow. Some of you know Shefa Gold, who's a wonderful teacher and singer of Jewish nigunim. She took that name Shefa from Kabbalah.
Thank you. And thank you for spending time on the Hebrew and explaining the Aramaic to us. So the second question related to these stories is related to your book in general, which is you give these readings, and some of them are very short. And I don't have the book in front of me, but do you expand on them like you're doing right now, or do you give the readings and then we have to, without a guide, figure out what they say?
There's some commentary at the back of the book, Leva Kabbalah, not very expansive, just trying to explain the symbolism or certain terms or where a phrase comes from. So in that book, I don't do it. I would say in my book, God and the Big Bang, I develop more some of these ideas. Some of the passages we've looked at, I include there, and I talk more about what that would mean in terms of theology. There's a short intro to the Essential Kabbalah where I talk a little bit more about the theology.
And since you mentioned meditation, um, is that in fact a major form of worship or prayer by Kabbalists in general, meditation? Is that referenced throughout the different texts or historically as what the Kabbalists used to do? Or and then someone asked, does that tie into like Hasidic Nigunim, wordless prayer?
Yeah, I would say meditation is very important for the Kabbalists. Those of you who want to explore it more fully, the best book on this is simply called Meditation and Kabbalah by R.E.A. Kaplan. I'm sure many of you know that name. R.E.A. Kaplan has written a lot of books, translated Sefer Yetzirah, translated the Bahir, a number of wonderful books. This is one of his finest books on Kabbalah, Meditation and Kabbalah. He has a more popular book on Kabbalah and meditation, but this is he brings together the texts and the traditions. So basically, I would say there are a few different forms of Kabbalistic meditation. One is meditating on the prayers in the prayer book. In other words, not inventing new prayers, but working with the Siddur, working with the traditional prayers, but pausing over individual words, connecting words with individual qualities of God, what are called the 10 Sefirot. I intentionally have not gone into any detail about the Sefirot because it's so complex. Maybe next week we'll just take a quick peek at the diagram of the Sefirot. I'm sure many of you have looked at that, the tree of life or the Sefirot. So part of Kabbalistic meditation would be praying a prayer and matching up individual words of that prayer to different Sefirot, to different qualities of God. But in addition to that, there's more focused meditation on divine names. Okay, meditating on the name Yud He Vav He, YHVH, meditating on the different divine names, or meditating on simply combinations of letters, combining the letters of the alphabet into what we might think are nonsense syllables. Abraham Abulafia developed that especially. You could say that's a way to short circuit the normal workings of the brain so that you're not focusing on any particular word with a normal meaning, but just loosening the bonds of conscious awareness and delving or dissolving into this stream of divine energy. So there are traditional prayers that turn into meditations and then meditating on divine names. And one of my favorite things is just to focus on that verse from Psalms. To you, silence is praise, to try to dwell in silence. If you find your mind wandering, the Kabbalists would often come back to the breath, as we find in many traditional forms of meditation. Abulafia tried to combine breathing with letter combinations, with meditating on the divine name. The various forms, and to discover more, have a look at Kaplan's book.
The related question was the Nigun as a
Oh yeah. Yeah,
style of worship.
this certainly there was singing and chanting earlier, but Hasidism really perfects the nigun. And sometimes you have nigunim that are connected with verses or phrases, but the really pure form of Hasidic nigun is without any words, right? Just la 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 or ay ay ay, or not to get trapped into specific meanings and specific known phrases or words, but to let the mind soar, to let the soul soar, to let the mind dissolve by chanting a nigun over and over. So the early Hasidic masters, and then the later Hasidic teachers, Chabad, Bobov. Most of the Hasidic dynasties have dozens or even hundreds of nigunim. Nigun means melody, but it refers to a wordless chant.
Thank you. I think we have time for just a few more texts if you want to jump in.
Great. Let's look at something else here. Okay, I want to move to something simple. We've been talking about some very dense theology, and I want to look at something very beautiful and simple here. This is begin just simply with a command in Genesis chapter 12. God said to Abram, go forth, right? This is even before Abraham is called Abraham. His name originally was Avram, and then God adds a hey to the name Avraham. But when God first appears to Abram, the first thing that God says to Abram is, go forth. Now, what is the Hebrew? Lech lecha, right? Lech lecha, it's the name of a Torah portion. The third Torah portion, right? The first Torah portion is Breshit. The second Torah portion is Noach, about Noah and the flood. The third Torah portion of Genesis is Lech lecha because of this command. God said to Avram, Lech lecha. Now, what does Lech lecha mean? It's translated go forth, but what does it really mean? Two Hebrew words, Lech means go. It's the command form. It's a tzivui. It's the command to go, Lech. What does lecha mean? Lecha means to you. So literally it means go to you. So it's translated really, get yourself going. Lech lecha is get yourself going. But literally it's go to you, and that's how the Zohar takes it. This is what the Zohar has to say about the verse. The Zohar's comment here is just this. The next paragraph is already a Hasidic expansion. But we have three elements here, okay? The italics is the verse from Genesis, Lech lecha. What does the Zohar say? God said to Abram, go to yourself. Know yourself. Fulfill yourself. That's the original command God gives Abram. Go to yourself. Okay, this you could say goes back to Plato. Okay, it goes back to all spiritual and mystical teachers. Know yourself, right? What could be harder? What could be more important? What could be more difficult? Know yourself. Don't just know books. Don't just know languages. Don't just know facts and details and information. Know yourself. So God is saying, what is the basic spiritual command of the Torah? Lech lecha, go to you. It's such a wonderful teaching. This is such a revolution to most Jews. I think you could probably surprise your rabbi maybe and ask your rabbi, what does actually Lech lecha mean? It means go to you. Go to yourself. It's a beautiful example of how you can find spiritual meaning in the simple Hebrew words, okay? Ari's question before is so important. What's the Hebrew behind this? This works much better in the Hebrew than in the English. Lech lecha, go to you. And the Hasidic author then spells this out a little bit more fully. This verse is addressed to every person. Search and discover the root of your soul so that you can fulfill it and restore it to its source, its essence. The more you fulfill yourself, the closer you approach your authentic self. Okay, I think it's a beautiful expansion, but I think it's good then to go back to the Zohar, go to yourself, and then to go back to the Torah. Lech lecha, go to you. Go deep within yourself. That's the spiritual search. That's the mystical search. And that's what the Torah records as God's very first command to our forefather. Let's look at maybe one more passage and then a couple more questions. The journey of the soul. Okay, this is actually written by Moses de Leon, who is the main author of the Zohar. This is not from the Zohar. This is from one of his Hebrew writings. The Zohar he wrote in Aramaic, but he also wrote a good number of books of Kabbalah in Hebrew, in which he sometimes refers to the Zohar. This is what he says about the soul. The purpose of the soul entering this body is to display her powers and actions in this world, for she needs an instrument, By descending to this world, she increases the flow of her power to guide the human being through the world. Okay, the soul is feminine, so every she here is referring to the soul. Thereby, she perfects herself above and below, attaining a higher state by being fulfilled in all dimensions. If she is not fulfilled both above and below, she is not complete. Before descending to this world, the soul is emanated from the mystery of the highest level. While in this world, she is completed and fulfilled by this lower world. Departing this world, she is filled with the fullness of all the worlds, the world above and the world below. At first, before descending to this world, the soul is imperfect. She is lacking something. By descending to this world, she is perfected in every dimension. Okay, it's a beautiful teaching. I want to say what's most striking, what's most radical about this is the statement that the soul is imperfect. Right before it descends to the world, the soul is imperfect. That's very unusual in a spiritual teaching, right? Usually what's said about the soul, that the soul is perfect. Maybe it has to come down into this lower world, but it yearns to return to paradise, to the world of bliss, right? To be in the divine realm. So Moses de Leon, writing in Spain in the 13th century, he's saying, no, the soul is actually lacking something. When the soul is in paradise, right? When the soul is rocking in God's bosom, when the soul is in the Garden of Eden before it ever enters a body, it's incomplete. Why is it incomplete? Because it hasn't experienced the physical realm. Okay, there's something redemptive about physical reality. It's not that spirit is good and the physical body is bad. These are two aspects of reality, and the fullest existence is when the two are united. So the soul is made complete by the opportunity to experience the world. Then it will eventually return to heaven, but it returns now in a more fulfilled state. So this is really, you could say this is a critique of traditional spirituality. Traditional spirituality is much more dualistic, right? The soul is pure and the body is somehow tainted. The Gnostics took this to the extreme, right? That the world is evil and heaven is good. You don't have that stark dualism in Judaism, but you have a little bit of it, certainly in medieval Christianity and medieval Judaism. You have a lot of body versus soul. But the Bible is really free of that. In the Bible, in fact, some people say there's no such thing as the soul in the Bible. Robert Alter's new translation of the Hebrew Bible, called the Hebrew Bible, it's a superb translation. He doesn't use the word soul once in the entire Bible. The words that we think of as meaning soul, nefesh, ruach, neshama, those don't necessarily mean soul. They could mean essence. Ruach means spirit. Neshama means breath. So there's a sense in which the Bible is not yet locked into this dualism of body and soul. The Talmud and medieval Jewish thought are somewhat colored by that. And Kabbalah, at least this Kabbalist, is breaking away from that duality and saying that the soul and the body fulfill one another. Let's pause there and see if there are questions about what we've just looked at.
So, every time we learn a piece, there's like 12,000 questions, and they're deep questions about, well, how do you do this? How do you improve yourself? And that's nothing we can get to in this class, but I do want to recognize that there are questions in that regard. And I think like that's where you go to your Hasidic team master, right? To work on how do you do this, or your teacher or your
Yeah.
mentor, other ways. So, focusing on that text, about the soul, is that where, I mean, I've heard, certainly in the Hasidic world, but particularly through Chabad, the argument when people die young, that their soul has reached its goal and is called back to heaven. Is that tied into this type of teaching, saying that the soul comes here to do something, to learn something, and therefore people who die younger have achieved that goal? Is that where they get this teaching from, for example?
Yeah, it's certainly connected to this. You have similar teachings in the Zohar trying to explain the suffering or the death of children. I don't think it's really satisfactory. I think it might be comforting, certainly, a parent who's gone through that ultimate tragedy. If there's some words of comfort that help, you don't want to, reject it. But I think we should be skeptical of that kind of teaching. It is linked to what we just read.
Right. I'm not supporting the teaching. I'm just
Yeah,
wondering if this is the
yeah,
origin of that type of
yeah,
teaching within the
yeah.
Kabbalah.
No, it's definitely linked to what we just saw. The soul is here on a mission. The soul is here to learn something. In another passage, Moses de Leon says, you shouldn't mourn over death. You should realize now the soul has learned what it has come to learn. So it definitely connects with what you're referring to.
Hmm. A few questions about reincarnation and the Kabbalah and how it would relate
Hmm.
to what you just read to us.
Yeah, so that we haven't mentioned yet at all. The Hebrew word is very colorful word, Gilgul. You could spell it Gilgul. Gilgul literally means rolling. So the notion is the soul galgal in Hebrew means wheel. So Gilgul is rolling, recirculating, you might say. The soul is rolling from one body into another body. It's interesting how that develops. Of course, you never have that in the Bible. You never have it in the Talmud. Sadja Gaon, one early Jewish philosopher, criticizes it very much. There must have been Jews in his environment in Iraq who were coming across that teaching. So it certainly is not a traditional Jewish teaching. It does appear in the Zohar, but then it develops much more fully in that next creative period in Sfat. So what is it in the Zohar? In the Zohar, Gilgul, really Gilgul only happens, it's not a punishment, it's really an opportunity. If you haven't fulfilled certain important mitzvot, if you haven't fulfilled certain important mitzvot, then you're given an opportunity by being reincarnated so that you can fulfill those mitzvot. That's really what it is in the Zohar. By the time we get to Isaac Luria and Cordovero and Sfat, it's much more general. Gilgul happens almost to everyone, and it's seen as a progression, as a learning. So it becomes prominent in Kabbalah. I think here too one should be skeptical and critical. I mean, it's certainly true that a human body is, in a sense, recycled, right? The body decomposes and becomes part of something. It then re-enters creation in some new form. But I basically I take a wait and see attitude to this. That we really don't know. I don't think no one knows what happens at death. And Gilgul is something that the Kabbalah develops. Here too, you could say it's to explain suffering, right? If a child has died young, well, maybe that soul will be reincarnated. So I think it's almost a desperate attempt to deal with suffering and with the injustice in the world, right? If something isn't fair, well, maybe in some future life it will be uh, corrected. But it is a prominent notion of Kabbalah, especially with Lurianic Kabbalah.
Well, we're just about out of time. I feel like this is like a therapist thing. You get to the good stuff and then, up, out of time.
So one more
Um,
question.
you want one more question?
There must
Fine.
be one more
There's
good
a
one.
lot
Take
more.
take
So
take, take your time. Pick
okay,
a juicy one.
Ellen asks, we talked about Kabbalah and Kabbalah maybe talking about maybe addressing our role as humans in relation to God, why God created us, what God needs from us, how we are part of God, and so on. And she asks, well, this teaching you just gave us about the soul coming down, going through the body, getting perfected, going back to God, is that an example of our relationship as humans with God? Because we're this vessel for perfection, or perfecting.
Yeah, I think it's a way to speak about, the oneness, right? That we think of ourselves as separate. You might say, I mean, what is the soul in Kabbalah? The soul is a divine spark, right? So every human has one spark of divinity. Each of us is a spark of divinity enclosed in a shell. That shell is the body, that shell is the personality. But within us, there's some spark of that oneness. So each of us contains the oneness, but we express it in our unique way. And maybe at death, that spark is reunited with the whole. the part is reunited with the whole. So the return of the soul to God is a way to reflect on the oneness that underlies it all.
But it's more than that, because according to the text you just shared, the soul returns in better shape. It's
Hmm.
improved, and therefore we have improved God, if that is even possible, or we
Mm,
have
mm.
participated. It's like this circularity. We as humans participate in this continual improvement
Yeah,
or evolution.
there's a beautiful name of God. Maybe next week we'll talk about Shekhinah, the divine feminine. And one of her most beautiful names, it's not in the Zohar, it's in an early Kabbalist. He calls the Shekhinah Sod HaEfshar. Okay, Sod, of course, is secret. Efshar is possible, the secret of the possible. That's his name for God. God is the secret of the possible. So you could say God is pure potentiality, but God needs us. Remember last time we talked about the divine need for human beings. So we help God evolve. We help God turn into everything he or she could turn into. So our human existence is an actualization of the divine potential. And as you say, specifically, our individual soul has developed God, has developed that divine spark in a unique way. And when it returns, there's some joy. There's some joy at that reunion. There's some joy that God sees all that God could turn into, thanks to each of us.
It's always nice to end on an up note. So thank you so much for your teaching today and sharing. And looking forward to the final session in this series. Maybe I'll ask you by email to share with me like the most important books or writings
Yeah.
in Kabbalah, so that we can have a list for people. Obviously, the Zohar is the book, but there are books before the Zohar, there are books after the Zohar. What are they? What are the writings? Just so we have a nice list. But with that, I wish everybody a meaningful day. Enjoy your breath and enjoy nature. Go out, commune with God and yourself, and lech lecha, I guess. There must be a feminine version of that too, right?
Yeah. Lechi lach.
Right.
Lechi lach.
Lechilach, correct. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Professor Matt, and
All the best. Shalom.
see you all next week, if not sooner. Take care.
Great.